Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's program on this Tuesday. It is the 21st day of January, and it is a wonderland, a winter wonderland here in Appalachia. And I'm kind of thinking that for many of you, it probably may be where you are as well, because from what I've seen in the media, this storm is pretty massive, and a lot of people are experiencing the snow. Washington D.C. is pretty well shut down. They're anticipating 7 inches, and I just before we went on the air, I walked the dog. We have 2 cats, and of course they go out with me, and to watch the dog just thought he had died and gone to heaven. I mean, he couldn't believe this. This was awesome, and so she had a great time. And one of the cats, the youngest one, romps with her in the snow. So it was kind of neat. The other cat just climbed up a tree and sat there and waited until we were done our business, and then we were coming back in, and then he ran for the door. He's the older one. He's about 11. So anyway, it's beautiful out there, but now we're anticipating the plunge in temperatures, which is already underway. And so for the next day or two, we're going to have very, very cold temperatures. And with this kind of snow on the ground, what that means is the melt is going to be minimal, and things are going to be tied up for a while. So as long as people don't lose their power and don't freeze to death or have plenty to eat or whatever, I tried to tell myself that I tried to imagine when I was young, and I loved this so much. And when I watched the dog and the cat playing in the snow, I kind of thought, it reminded me of the fact that this was really kind of neat. And it's not, it's a pain if you have to go out and all that. But on the other hand, I guess maybe I'm becoming a little bit overly obsessed with moving into my senior years, and I've got to try to recover a little bit of that youthfulness that used to just love this stuff, and just wonder how many inches were going to fall before the snow stopped. We're still snowing here in our area, in the Beckley area. Not quite as hard as it was, but for about 2.5 hours there, boy, it was something else. It was a whiteout, and it was absolutely gorgeous, absolutely good, totally silent and absolutely gorgeous. It was wonderful. It is a pleasure to be with you again today, and yesterday I had announced that, as you know, we started an hour earlier yesterday, and I announced that we would not be doing a program tomorrow because Bob Kincaid was going to be on the road. Well, for obvious reasons, Bob Kincaid is not going to be on the road tomorrow, so we will be doing our program. However, it will be an hour early. I have a board meeting scheduled for 5:30 tomorrow evening here in Beckley, although I'm at this point uncertain whether, in fact, we'll be able to hold it or not, because I don't know that people will be able to get there. But at this point, it's scheduled. So with that in mind, I'd kind of like to schedule the program for an hour early tomorrow. So in the East, we'll be doing the Virtual Center from 3 to 5 rather than our regular hours of 4 to 6. Love to hear from you. The topic that we've been on a week ago, of course, and then we kind of picked it up yesterday, and I had a number of emails, which is really wonderful, I think. Although in a few cases, I really wish that the people who sent the emails would call, because the questions or the issues that they raised were really, really good. In one case, I was alerted to an article which I had not seen. I believe Jack was the one that alerted me to this. It was an article by Ana Marie Cox on just the subject that we're talking about, and she is a noted blogger, and she's appeared frequently on Rachel Maddow's show, and I think right now she works for GQ magazine, and she's also the political blogger for Washington Politics with The Guardian. So, and I've seen her a number of times on TV, and she's quite sharp. And anyway, Jack alerted me to this article she had written on this topic about technology, and I printed it off. I told him, thanked him, and told him that I indeed did intend to incorporate this into some of our programming, because it was very good. There were a number of insights in there and points she makes which I think are worth mentioning. And so I do encourage you to call if you are so inclined. We would love to hear from you. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I have to say that as an intro that this topic is one that it just kind of gets bigger and bigger. I'm finding coming across more and more information. I'm learning more and more and about it, and the fact that there are more people who are focusing on it and discussing it than I had dreamed, and that's good, because I think it's a relevant topic. And that's one of the things I came away with in my reading. One of the things I came away with was an appreciation for the fact this really is an important topic. And in fact, as I mentioned, on Kindle, I had ordered the book "Who Owns the Future" by Lanier. That was the book that Joe Nocera wrote, the piece that we discussed yesterday about in the New York Times. And Joe Nocera said it was the best book he read all last year. The author's name is Jaron Lanier, Jaron. I ordered the book on Kindle, and for a number of reasons, classes I'm preparing our program and things, I haven't gotten as far along in the book as I'd hoped. However, my wife has, and it's very interesting. She spent a good part of the weekend looking at the book. She's about a third of the way through it, I guess. So today, because of the snow, and so much was canceled, I made it a point to spend about an hour and a half in my Kindle on this book, and I read quite a bit. It's a fairly substantive book, and it's deep. It's very deep. 25 years ago, this would have been classified as science fiction. Fact of the matter is, what becomes very clear as you read this book is that we are living science fiction, what used to be science fiction. And my assumption is that throughout the past, that's probably been true in history anyway, that things that people speculate might happen, indeed many times do happen. And so it makes sense that what people at one point in time would define as fiction, or as scientific fantasy, would come to pass. So I don't know that phenomenon is that unique to our day in our age. But it's very clear from what we've already talked about that we are effectively living in what was 25, 30 years ago science fiction. And there are a couple of, especially one example that I wanted to share with you today. But what I wanted to say as part of the introduction is that I found myself a couple of times today. I have several books of poetry laying around the house. For years I've been one of those people that likes to pick up and just read a poem, a short poem occasionally, in the evening before dinner or something. Just if you have an extra 10 minutes, I'll often pick one of these books up and just read a poem. And oftentimes, if it's one that I really enjoyed, I'll try to make a mental note of it and go back and reread it again because I've liked it so much. And I've made it a point to buy a couple of books by poet laureates, and it's not, I like some of the standard poetry that all of us grew up on and recited in school and all of that, true, but much of the contemporary poetry from recent poet laureates in the United States, I find some of that particularly insightful and brilliant. It's wonderful writing. Today, because of the topic that we've been dealing with, I found myself reading a poem by Wordsworth, another one by Tennyson, and I caught myself reading Tennyson, and I kept thinking to myself, what am I doing? Is there any significance to what I'm doing here? And I think I found myself going back and looking at some of the so-called romantic poetry, because I was really trying to reground myself and shake a little bit of the conversation we've had about machines taking over for people and computers being able to cognitively outthink human beings and that kind of thing. And it's pretty dehumanizing and pretty depressing. And so, in a sense, and because of that, I found myself going back and reading some really good poetry. And I wanted to share that with you because I didn't do it consciously, but I found myself doing it. And I picked up the book this morning, and I was thumbing through the book of poems, and I came across one by Wordsworth, and I read it, and I got about 3/4 of the way through it, and it suddenly dawned on me what I was doing. And I said, this is really interesting. I did this without really consciously thinking about it. But I kind of wanted the kind of sense. And then I picked up one of the books, and it's divided into well, I guess you could say chapters, but they're kind of units, and things on romance and getting old and all of those things. The poems are organized in categories like that. And I was reading a couple of the poems in the section on love and a couple on character. And I guess what I was trying to do was reinforce the idea that being human still matters. And so I wanted to share that. In fact, I made a point this morning, a mental note, that when we went on the air today, I would kind of mention that because I thought it was kind of interesting. Anyway, one of the emails that I received raised a question about, first of all, the two emails that the same person sent, and I wanted to deal with both of them. The first one I can deal very quickly, and it was in reference to comments that I had made during yesterday's program about asking students to write, and especially using active words like asking students to compare and contrast and things like that. And the listener who emailed me wanted to know specifically, wanted a little bit more information on compare and contrast questions. In other words, and I think most of us have seen them. I mean, how many times have we seen people or exams that other people took, which would begin compare and contrast, the Civil War and the American Revolution, or World War I and World War II, or something like that. The women's movement in America with the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, something, things like that. And so the person asked a question which on the surface seemed a little bit, kind of threw me for a minute, because I thought, well, really, I hadn't really thought about this, And then I thought, well, I'm not going to go to the dictionary and look up definitions of compare and the word compare and the word contrast. So I sat down and I took a couple of moments to reflect on this. And let me say right now that that's really admirable on the part of the person who came up with the question. After I got through, I answered the email, but at the same time, I made it a point that I was going to mention this today, and I was going to thank the email for raising the question, because this is one of those examples of something that I just kind of took for granted until asked. And so the question was, when you ask for compare, what are you after? When you look for contrast, what are you after? And so I thought for a couple of minutes, and I responded to the email. And basically, the idea of compare is obviously similarities and differences between issues or items or events or people or eras or whatever it is that seem on the surface to be somewhat related or somewhat connected, that seem to have a lot of things in common. And so by asking the question, compare and contrast about things that apparently seem to have a lot in common, the question itself seems to suggest that there's more to it than appears on the surface, that while there are a lot of similarities, there are probably a lot of differences as well. So when I say compare, that's essentially what I'm saying. You know, this particular era, this, you know, item 1 had these characteristics, and item 2 had these characteristics that were in common with item 1, but here are some of the characteristics that were different, or something like that. But then the contrast part asks a little bit more than that of students. It almost asks students to take it one step beyond the compare. And that is to point out raise questions about the issues being compared in terms of intent, in terms of desired outcome, in terms of impact on people. In other words, did each of them have the same impact on people? Was the intent of one the same as the obvious intent behind the other? In other words, was each item pretty much created, or did it happen with the same outcomes in mind? Who was hurt by a particular situation? Who was helped by a particular situation? Were there winners and losers? Those kinds of questions, it would seem to me, ask a student to take the issue much deeper than the compare, which is pretty much superficial. And I don't mean superficial in a negative way, because a good comparison, which is substantive, in other words, that really says something, is very valuable. But the contrast idea gets beyond the obvious to the not so obvious. And I got an email, a response back from the listener who made the point that explanation seemed to satisfy him. But the reason I mention it, because again, it was a darn good question, and I thank the listener for asking it, because it forced me to think about something that I hadn't really thought about. You know, when I ask the question, I mean, I know what I'm looking for in terms of the particular content in mind, but I hadn't really thought through what I'm talking about when I ask them to compare and ask them to contrast. And, you know, I mean, it would be very obvious that a student could say, what's the difference? And in fact, there is a difference. So anyway, that was one of the emails he sent. The other one was much more germane to the topic that we were discussing on yesterday's program. And it related to comments I had made about John Locke and the idea of the commons, because so much emphasis on John Locke is focused on his idea of private property and the idea that government is created more than anything else to protect private property. And of course, a lot of people in today's world have a preference for that John Locke. The John Locke that they're not too comfortable with is the John Locke who, when he talks about property, makes it a point that you have a right to ownership of property that you put labor into, only so long as the amount of property you claim is not more than you can use. The idea of acquiring property for the sake of owning it and keeping it from somebody else is not something that Locke takes too kindly to. But that whole side of Locke oftentimes is ignored in much of the literature, especially conservative literature. And so I think that I think it's very, very significant that we be aware of that. But anyway, the question that was asked related to Locke and the idea of the commons and the idea of civilization. And basically the question was, how does Locke and his idea of the commons relate to civilization, to the idea of civilization? And that, too, is a pretty darn good question. Because, obviously, Locke was pre-Industrial Revolution. Locke wrote pretty much right at the beginnings of what becomes home manufacture, home industry. But before anything that we would call the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And so Locke is totally unfamiliar with the factory system and the negatives of the factory system. And I'm thinking John Dickens here, Charles Dickens rather. Think Charles Dickens and Hard Times and Tale of Two Cities and those kinds of things about the worst aspects of the Industrial Revolution in England principally. And all of this was post-Locke. And obviously, I mean, I have problems equating that with civilization. But the fact of the matter is, what Locke was laying out in his theory on the origins of government, which were his two treatises on civil government, what Locke was basically setting up was a model for what becomes the kind of process that makes the Industrial Revolution and industrial as well as commercial capitalism happen. And of course, as we know, capitalism begins primarily with the commercial stage prior to the industrial stage. And the earliest stage of capitalism is what in the late 17th and 18th century is referred to as mercantilism. And the whole idea of the so-called natural laws of the market and the idea of supply and demand those kinds of things, that would be something that would be familiar to Locke. So there's absolutely no question that he had in his vision, if you will, an idea of what commercial capitalism was going to be like. And so his whole idea of property and the role of government in protecting property and the right of the people to control or to hold government accountable to some sort of a contractual arrangement that the people would make when they created government. All of that was very time sensitive. And to be to focus specifically on the political aspects of that, John Locke was writing in the late 17th century, 1688, 89, during the so-called Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution in England is when the king, James II, was banished from England, and the crown was offered to William and Mary, William of Orange and Mary. And depending on what you focus on, a lot of people will focus on this and say the principal issue here was that James was a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant country. And so banishing him was a way to banish Catholicism from access to the crown and securing the crown in the hands of Protestants. Politically, there's absolutely no question that the Glorious Revolution was the emergence of Parliament as the principal agent of British government. It's from this time that the king is forced to accept the crown on the terms laid out by Parliament. And so from this point forward, for all practical purposes, the Crown begins to lose the preeminent position of absolute power that the Crown had had throughout the period and throughout most of the 17th century. During the 17th century, there were 4 Stuart kings: James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, and the last one was James II. And James was driven out in 1689, and Parliament achieved supremacy in British government from that point on. Now, it's a little bit messier than that. It's not quite neat because the Crown is very reluctant to take a back seat, and throughout the early 18th century, the struggles between Parliament and the Crown continued to go on. And I'm thinking specifically in the early 18th century, under the Parliament under the leadership of Robert Walpole, very, very influential person, and he basically is jockeying with the king. And by this time, of course, you're getting the Georges. And, of course, George III, we know, was king during the American Revolution in the middle of the 18th century. But he's dealing with that family, and they're not willing to surrender power without a struggle. So there is all of this struggle between Parliament and the king for preeminence still going on even in the early 18th century. But so from a purely political point of view, what Locke is doing in his treatise on civil government is basically justifying the origins of government in such a way that government is limited rather than absolute. And that, of course, is quite consistent with the idea of parliamentary supremacy in England over the power of the king, which previously had been, early in the 17th century, power was claimed under the principle of divine right, that the king was God's representative on earth, and therefore, as God's representative on earth, the king was infallible, effectively. In other words, to challenge the king was to challenge God. And that's what the Civil War is about. And the Glorious Revolution finally nails it down by basically requiring the new king to agree to take the crown, but only on the terms dictated by Parliament. And Locke is writing to justify that process and that outcome. So, in a sense, what we're talking about is an emerging definition of civilization, to go back to the question of the emailer, an emerging idea of civilization. And what Locke is doing is laying out the groundwork, the foundations for an approach to government, the idea of popular government and limited government, that would basically define much more precisely in this modern age what the proper role for government would be and how much freedom people would have to have. And of course, we're talking here about entrepreneurs, the middle class business community of that period, so that they would not be strangled by government regulations and government control. So, in a sense, that's a good part of it. But that's a great question that the listener asked, and I hope that I was able to address it in a way that makes some sense. Anyway, at least that's the way it makes sense to me. One of the things that we talked about yesterday, we were looking at if you remember, as kind of a quick review, we were looking at Tom Friedman's article called "If I Had a Hammer Again," and we were looking at the idea of the so-called second machine age and the difference between the first one. And we were talking about the tremendous increase of the so-called information revolution, the digital revolution, and technology, which was fast taking over more and more of the cognitive abilities of human beings, and the problems that this raised in terms of things like education. In other words, technology, according to those two gentlemen who wrote the second machine age. Technology is moving forward at such a pace that it's becoming more and more impossible for the vast majority of people to keep up with it. So in effect, what it's doing is rendering more and more of society pretty much not an effective participant in the political process. It's creating real problems. It's destroying jobs. It's destroying the middle class. Because unlike the first machine age, where jobs were being destroyed, but on the other hand, they were being replaced by new jobs that sometimes required additional upgrades in skills. But many times the transfer from one job to the other was smooth. So in a sense, what economic growth was the idea of an expanding economy to such a degree that it was creating jobs faster than workers were being displaced under the idea of so-called creative destruction, where as progress happened, some jobs became outmoded and tended to disappear. But because jobs were being created so fast in a period of economic growth, there was unlimited opportunity, theoretically, for people to move from the jobs they lost into the new jobs being created. What makes the so-called second machine age different than that is that this particular experience is eliminating jobs, but it's not replacing them with new jobs. And I think there's no question that the context, the world which gives rise to this, is the situation that we find ourselves in after the so-called Great Recession of 2007 and 2008. There's absolutely no question that the economy is in recovery. But that recovery is not reflected in job creation. And that's confounding a lot of the experts. It's challenging. The administration is challenging the president, there's no question. And part of his explanation as to why that's true is the idea of inequality. The idea that while recovery has been underway, the benefits of that recovery have gone increasingly to the top 1% of income earners. Whereas actually the other 99%, for the most part, have experienced a reduction in income over the last 8 to 10 years. That's in part been the president's explanation as to the slowness of job creation. His political opponents, and I'm thinking specifically of John Boehner, his political opponents have argued that the reason that employers, even though they are beginning to recover from the recession, are not taking the profits they are making and pouring it into job creation is because they are not comfortable, they do not feel secure about the future. And again, depending on, I guess, your political preference, I interpret that to mean that what John Boehner is saying, in effect, is that we won't see jobs being created until after President Obama leaves the White House. That's the way I interpret it. But be that as it may, whether in fact that's accurate or not, the reality is that corporations in America are sitting on more cash, more money than any time in history. But for one reason or another, they're reluctant or only slowly beginning to reinvest that money in job creation. We've seen a few positive numbers in the most recent months about job creation. So it appears that recovery is happening, but it's happening much, much too slowly. Consequently, the unemployment insurance that many of the displaced have had has been running out. And now, as we know, just before the holiday break, Congress was reluctant to extend that unemployment. And when Congress comes back into session, the President's State of the Union message is the 28th, which is another week. That's when Congress will come back into session, and the Democrats have made it a point of asserting that extending unemployment insurance will be one of the first items on the table, one of the first orders of business. And of course, the question is whether, in fact, we're going to get back into this dysfunctional relationship between the Republican-controlled House and the Democratically controlled Senate. And so there, there we are. Well, one of the things we picked up on yesterday in the article by Joe Nocera on this book called "Who Owns the Future," Lanier's book. Lanier believes that that his topic, his subject matter, which is the growth of digital networks and the extent to which digital networks are almost wholly responsible for many of these things. And this is where we were yesterday at the end of our program. That Lanier believes that the problem that he is talking about, which is the creation of these digital networks, is pretty well what he calls hollowing out the middle class. In other words, it's destroying more and more of the middle class. And the reason it is because it is not creating jobs in the process. That ultimately what is driving the digital revolution, so to speak, is information, is data. And that data requires information from us. And so consequently, networks have companies are going out of their way to secure as much information and as much data as possible in order to generate or improve or streamline commercial sales, marketing, manufacturing, and all the rest of it, product definition and all the rest of it. So in a sense, there's no replacement jobs being generated for the jobs that are being replaced. And the example, if you remember, which I think is an incredibly profound example that is used, is the one that Lanier addresses about Kodak. The issue of Kodak and Instagram. At its height, writes Lanier, this is a quote from his book, Kodak employed more than 140,000 people. As I mentioned, I have his book and I've read this. Its profit, the corporation Kodak, not only was employing 140,000 people, but it was a corporation that was worth $28 billion. $28 billion. It is now bankrupt. Instagram has taken over most of the activity and product sales that used to be controlled by Kodak. And in 2012, Instagram was sold to Facebook for $1 billion. Instagram employs only 13 people. So in the transition from Kodak to Instagram, we have seen a loss in jobs from 140,000 people to 13. Obviously, that's a dramatic example, but it indicates the depth and the seriousness of the problem, because it's very obvious, as I mentioned yesterday, that for the most part, 140,000 employees at Kodak were not unskilled labor. Many of these were highly skilled people, whether they be in sales, technology, or whatever. And so for reasons which I guess we could pursue, But Kodak didn't keep up with the market changes. And so consequently it became vulnerable. And it disappeared. So that's a classic example of what's happening. So this is not creative destruction in terms of the creation, the destruction of some jobs and the creation of different jobs. This is destruction of jobs with no jobs to replace them. And presuming the skill levels of the people at Kodak that were displaced, one must conclude that many, if not most, of Kodak employees would be considered middle class. One would believe that the income levels and the fringe benefits enjoyed by these people in one of America's major corporations would have placed the majority of these 140,000 people in the middle class. So in effect, not only are we seeing a transition from one company to another, but we're seeing a tremendous loss in the middle class itself as a result of the kinds of technological change that's happening. Then, of course, the other question that we addressed was the issue of education. Is it possible, as is proposed here in this article, to reinvent education in such a way that it keeps up with the machines, that it is able to race with the machines, so to speak? And again, I think my conclusion is that there are serious questions about that. And that gets us into the whole idea of the core standards that are under discussion and debate in the country right now, as well as a number of other things. The reason that I think this is significant, and the reason I think it's a topic that we really need to devote time to, and the reason I believe that it's quite pertinent to the mission of this program, which is a program based on the Constitution of the United States and the responsibilities of citizens within the republic that Constitution creates. I think this is very significant, because one of the issues that we need to confront, and indeed it's confronted here, is the whole idea of work in our society. One of the things that came out of the Industrial Revolution and the culture, the definition of civilization that was informed so incredibly by the Industrial Revolution, is the whole idea of the dignity of work and the extent to which people measure their own self-worth by what they do. Anything that's happening in our culture, in our civilization, that is eliminating work and not replacing it with something else, has serious implications to the psyche of the society at large.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
Yes, Bob.
You've got a caller on the line. Mike would like to speak with you for a moment.
Sure thing. Thank you, Bob.
Yes, indeed.
Dr. Bill, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing fine. You know, I love this topic. I mean, I don't love it. It's very depressing. But I've been following it for quite a while.
It's scary. I love it too, though. I know what you mean.
Well, I've been following it since NAFTA was signed with Bill Clinton, NAFTA and GATT, and the discussion was going on, and the promise was made to unions that people he wouldn't sign NAFTA, and then he went ahead and did it. Then also what he said that really upset me was people are just going to have to retrain maybe 4 or 5 times for jobs in order to stay employed. And I was thinking, he didn't say anything about who was going to finance that education 4 or 5 times going back to school to retrain for jobs. Certainly the corporations weren't paying for it.
Right.
But what I wanted to bring up is there was a book out by Jeremy Rifkin, and I think he wrote a book on the meat industry at one time. And the book that he wrote in 1996 was called The End of Work.
Oh, I
and
remember this book.
Yeah, he was talking about not just the fact that he was explaining how the digital disruption would happen. I think that's what it's referred to as now.
Yeah.
Where it's going to replace robots and computers will replace people in the workplace. But he also in the book was at least discussing about what's going to replace the system that we're using now. And in that, with so many people unemployed, and you were discussing this a few days ago, I believe. With all the people that would be unemployed, the crime rate is going to soar. The cost of poverty is going to soar. And the current system, the laissez-faire theology that we're talking about, is all that we have to deal with it. And I just don't think it's up to the task. I think we're really going to have to look to our government for it. And I don't think capitalism is really the answer, although I've had a business for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I enjoyed being in business. I kind of like the small C capitalism. I enjoyed it. I liked the competition. It made me a better a business person. But what we're talking about here is just a completely different animal. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to get anywhere with it. I think we're going to have to look at socialism. But I just wanted to mention in the book, he talked about making the work week shorter to accommodate people who are unemployed, to make more jobs available. So instead of a 40-hour work week, it would head us toward a 30-hour work week or less. And the income that would be the diminished incomes would be subsidized by the government, so people wouldn't become poverty-stricken overnight. So there's a big discussion going on. There's more than just Jeremy Rifkin's book out there. This has been going on, and I have been tracking it for a number of years now. So it's sad that it took this long for it to come to light, so we have less time to plan for what's coming around the corner. So that's my comment, basically.
Mike, I think it's a great comment, and I think you're right. And I guess the answer might be that, before people can really take the subject seriously, there has to be more pain. Maybe that's the reason. Maybe there's just this period of unemployment that we're in now has been so long. I mean, people have been out of work for an inordinate amount of time compared to what people used to be. I mean, all my life I can remember people being out of work, but it was always a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but never a couple of years. Because especially with the technological changes that are occurring, if you're out of the workplace that long today, whatever skills you may have had are outdated, and you almost, and then it becomes even more necessary to get more difficult rather to get back into the system, more necessary to take classes and all of this, and then we get into the question of subsidies and what's happening in higher education and other places in terms of the cost of higher education being dumped on the backs of the people as the states have increasingly reduced the amount of support that they're giving education, at least higher education. And so you get into a number of issues. I think the reduction of hours is one of the things. What Lanier talks about in his book called Who Owns the Future, what he's talking about is these people that are making the inordinate wealth are the people at the top of the apex of these networks, these digital networks, the Jeff Bezoses and the Steve Jobses and those people, and that ultimately what has to happen. His point is that all of this is driven by information, and we are that information. And so his recommendation is that we've got to find a way to pay people for the information they contribute to this process. And that way it will not only retain, but it will grow the middle class, which in effect suggests that it will sustain capitalism. It'll be a totally different definition of middle class. But
go ahead.
Go ahead.
My question is I just know a lot of people who they didn't drop out of high school because they necessarily wanted to, but I don't know how many people are going to be able to go on to college and make it at a college level. I don't know how many people are going to be able to go on to a technical school and learn. If you grew up in the central city, I don't care how much bootstrap pulling you do. A lot of the disadvantages of being poor in a central city, or for that matter, a rural area, whether it's a family that's dysfunctional or a non-existent family, homelessness, drug addiction, so on and so forth. When you're growing up in that kind of you probably are familiar with the study that shows that kids that grow up in that type of environment suffer the same type of PTSD that kids in war zones grow up in.
That's right.
And that affects the way they're ready for being educated. They come into the school and they're not ready to sit down and learn. And those people at a disadvantage, are they going to be going to a college to learn how to be an engineer? There are some success stories, but the preponderance of that population is not going on to a local university, or even for that matter, a trade school. I hate to be, I'm not trying to, diminish people's abilities wherever they are in life, but I'm just saying that
that's the reality.
Yeah.
I feel the same way, Mike. I feel, and I find myself a lot of times saying, well, I hate to say this, but the questions that these people are raising is given the level of skill that this digital world that we're moving into demands, realistically, how many of our people can do that? Obviously more can than we're turning out now, because we have real deficiencies in what we're doing and how we're doing it. But the fact is, this whole idea of making education available to the entire population and giving everybody the opportunity to move into to play a meaningful role in the world they live in, that may be an impossible dream. And given the kinds of advances we're talking about now, when you mentioned about how many people are going to be able to handle technical education, and of course the irony is technical education today is a lot different. It used to be vocational education. It's not anymore. These people are highly skilled.
Let's see, three of the brother-in-laws that I have in the early 70s, maybe the late 60s, when they graduated, and some of them didn't, a couple of them didn't, but they were able to get jobs, family-supporting jobs, and being from Milwaukee, you'll be able to recognize the names of the businesses. One worked for Briggs & Stratton.
I know that
one worked for Harley Davidson, and another went to work for Master Lock, and then and actually he left his job at Master Lock and went to work for Harley Davidson, and then there was another that worked for Miller Brewery. So, and the one is still working for Miller Brewery. The point is they could just leave high school and they were able to start a family on the wage, and so it was after as you're. I'll just make one last point. I know we're getting maybe short on time here, but thanks to you and your show. I shouldn't give you credit for it because you might not want to take credit for it. But what I see in U.S. history is this constant back and forth between the lower classes and the wealthy, and it seems like that we, and I'm identifying with the 98, 99%, we seem to be taking one step forward and two steps back, and it's an ever-losing battle. I don't know that I don't even know if we would win what we had just discussed a few minutes ago, taking less wages and a government subsidy and stuff like that, because we need to be talking socialism so that people aren't so afraid to talk about what we have in store for us and how we're going to handle it, so that can at least be on the table. Right now, there's at this point, it seems like there's really no choice. we have to stick with this failing system, and I don't know how much longer I'll be on the planet, but I do have children. So anyway, that's kind of where I wanted to leave it. And thanks for taking my call.
Mike, thank you for calling. Oh my heavens, what a beautiful, wonderful call. Thank you. You raise so many beautiful points, and to mention Rifkin's book. I remember that book. I remember that book coming out so well. And Jeremy Rifkin. Jeremy Rifkin was a very, very active, well-known person in the 60s and 70s. He was one of the leaders of the resistance movement in the 1960s and 70s, and very, very prompt. And the issues you raised, because the point that I was on when you called, and I think your call is so timely, is the whole issue of what work means in this society to us, and how are we going to handle a situation which is eliminating the opportunity for the vast majority of us to work, when most of us literally define our sense of worth by what we do. And so clearly, government guaranteeing a living wage to people merely touches the surface. It doesn't really deal with the substance, because people need to believe that they earned that themselves, that they've done something and contributed something which brought them a living wage. And they need to have a sense that they made a substantive contribution to the society that they're living in. We all do. I think we all need that. And traditionally, that's been a major selling point in the whole idea of the importance and the value of work. We have become, I think, and I'm just off throwing this idea out, but I think that we've become much more focused on the outcomes of work in terms of what we're producing and what we're selling. And the numbers we look at constantly are measuring, seeking to measure output and input, and whether the numbers are going up or whether the numbers are going down, and we've become much more focused in recent years on the products of work than the value of work itself. And if we are honest with ourselves and we really believe what throughout the history of this country we have argued about the importance of work and the value of work, then whatever solution that we come up with, whether it's reducing the work week from 40 hours to 30, or whether it's something a lot more involved than that, is going to have to take into consideration the psyche of the worker, the psyche of the people involved. I think there's a tremendous, I was going to say challenge. It is a challenge. But there's a tremendous opportunity here for unions. I really think that organized labor can really get their arms around this and make the worker an integral part of whatever reforms we find it necessary to make in this kind of a system. I think we have reached the point where we can no longer look to the few to keep the society going as we know it. Because, as more and more people are driven out of the workforce, we are creating the ingredients of a very, very dangerous social situation in this country. There's absolutely no question that all of the guarantees that our society developed from the mid-20th century on with Roosevelt's New Deal, guaranteeing people access to owning their own home and what that means in terms of the stability and the sense of worth that it brings to people in this country. And for us to basically endorse changes in our economy that have cut seriously into people's ability to own a home and maintain a home, retain a home, and not have it foreclosed on, and to basically suggest that the economy is recovering because the housing numbers are up, when in fact, when you look at it, the vast majority of the real estate deals that are taking place are people buying homes that were foreclosed on by other people. In other words, the real estate bubble created, the breaking of the real estate bubble created a tremendous a degree of dislocation in this society. The same people that are buying property are not the people that lost it. And if we don't take seriously what we're going to do about the numbers of people that have been driven from their homes and driven from the opportunity to own homes and are being denied the opportunity to find meaningful work and all the rest of it, we basically have the ingredients of a smoldering social situation in this country which we're not prepared for. With that, we've reached the top of our first. And, you know, before we take a brief break, I want to thank Mother very, very much. I think some of the points that you raised are just the kind of points that we need. When we come back, I'm going to open the second hour, believe it or not, with a quotation from Aristotle, which is kind of interesting, but I can't take credit for this. This is linear. But first, we'll take a 5-minute break. We're at the top of the hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien, and after a brief break, I was going to say big break, but it's 5 minutes is a big break. We'll be right back. Thank you. Please stay tuned. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. It is 6 minutes after the hour, our second hour of today's program. If you are just joining us, welcome to the program. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I want to thank you for staying with us. And I won't go into this any further, but if you were with us during our first hour, you were privy to the call from Mike that we received in our first hour. I think just an incredibly informative call, and I think what Mike did, and I appreciate it, is kind of reinforce the significance of the topic, and I think it is, and that's why we've been pursuing it, and I think we'll probably be pursuing it for a bit longer, because I think it's very, very important. We'll keep coming back to it, obviously. One of the pieces that I read over the last 24 hours made the point that with the President of the United States delivering the State of the Union message on the 28th of this month, which is obviously next week, that it would be more than appropriate for consideration of some sort of a commission or some sort of a presidential a committee or commission to look rather seriously into this, assuming that there isn't already one, and my guess is that there probably is not, because at most it would essentially assign a priority level to this that I think would be well worth it. Again, welcome to our program. Thank you for tuning in to our program and to the Head On Radio Network. I really appreciate that, as I'm sure the folks at Head On do as well. We would love to hear from you. We had a wonderful call in our first hour. We would love to hear from you with your thoughts. And the one thing I know with this topic is everybody's got thoughts, because this is one that at one point or another everybody has spent time on. But again, I don't know that there's an answer. I don't even know if we're doing a good job in adequately defining the questions. But I think there are a number of them, and we'll pursue these again in a moment. Let me share with you our phone number. The number is area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly on this matter or other matters as well, I would love to hear from you. I get a number of emails which recommend articles and things that you've seen in the course of your reading, and I appreciate those so much. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, IEN, 906, all one word, @gmail.com. I had mentioned that we would open with a quote from Aristotle, and actually this is the beginning of, right following Lanier's second chapter. He has a number of interludes, and this is one, and I wanted to share it with you. It's kind of a mini chapter between chapters, if you will. It only covers about 5 pages, but it's well worth it. And basically what Lanier points out is that indirectly Aristotle addressed the role of people in a hypothetical high-tech world. So this is not something that's new with us, folks. So let me, if I can, share this quote from Aristotle. If every instrument could accomplish its own work, obeying or anticipating the will of others, like the statues of Daedalus or the tripods of Hephaestus, which, says the poet, of their own accord entered the assembly of the gods. If, in like manner, the shuttle would weave and the plectrum touch the lyre without a hand to guide them, chief workmen would not want slaves, nor masters slaves. Excuse me. Chief workmen would not want servants, nor masters slaves. Basically, the implication here is the idea of high-tech work and what it does. And his whole idea is that at that time, the idea of servants and slaves primarily was generated by the sense that there was work that needed to be done, and we had to basically find people to do it. And so by basically displacing these people, and of course realizing that at the time Aristotle was writing, slaves and servants were not considered citizens. We're talking about a situation in our own case where we're all citizens. We're kind of all in this together. Let me share with you what Lanier says about this particular quote. At this ancient date, a number of possibilities were at least slightly visible to Aristotle's imagination. One was that the human condition was in part a function of what machines could not do. Another was that it was possible to imagine, at least hypothetically, that machines could do more. The synthesis was also conceived. Better machines could free and elevate people, even slaves. I would suggest to you that's a very positive way of looking at it. I'm kind of guessing that Aristotle's priority was not to elevate slaves, because I don't think slaves were, but again, that's just an opinion on my part. Lanier goes on, if we could show Aristotle the technology of our own times, I wonder what he would make of the problem of unemployment. Would he take Marx's position that better machines create an obligation to provide care and dignity to people who no longer need to work? Or would Aristotle say, kick the unneeded ones out of town? The polis is only for the people who own the machines, or do what machines still cannot do. Would he stand by idly as Athens was eventually depopulated? And I would suggest to you those two options that Linnaeus suggests for Aristotle are the kind of options we have today. And the question is, are we staring in the face the idea of groups of people that we are increasingly beginning to define as throwaways? There's no such thing in our society. Everything we are about as a culture is anathema to that second option. Basically, then, we're stuck with the other option, which is to find a way to provide care and dignity to people who no longer need to work as they are being displaced. This is what Lanier says. He finds both of those options bogus. He said, I'd like to think the best of Aristotle and assume that he would realize that both choices are bogus. Machine autonomy is nothing but theater. Information needn't be thought of as a freestanding thing, but rather as a human product. This, of course, is his thesis. It is entirely legitimate to understand that people are still needed and valuable even when the loom can run without human muscle power. It is still running on human thought. Basically, of course, the issue here and the point that Lanier is making is that we have to find a way to pay people for the information that they are providing that is allowing this revolution to go on. So in need is the digital revolution for information, for data, that agencies and corporations are willing to give us things that we seem to think are valuable in exchange for our information. I don't know about you, but for me, if you've been on the internet recently, you've probably, or whatever you were looking at, you've probably been interrupted by a voice message which basically suggests that if you are willing to take a very brief survey, we'll give you we'll make sure that we send you an appropriate gift. And usually, and I found as I look at these things, if you look at the survey, it usually takes less than a minute. And it's, are you looking at this at home? You know, they're usually 3 or 4 very basic questions, which don't seem to reveal anything about us as people. And then in return for that information, you are usually offered a choice of 3 gifts. And then they're usually not gifts because you have to pay the shipping on them. And of course, chances are that if you do it online and you pay online, then you're giving them access to your information in the process. But they are giving you something for your information. And so the fact of the matter is, what Lanier is suggesting is we need to find a way to pay people for that information, which in a sense would not only retain a middle class, it would actually grow a middle class. It would provide ways that all of us could remain instrumental participants in the world we lived in. And so therefore the issues of dignity and self-esteem and all of the rest of it would not be compromised. After we finished our program yesterday, last evening I was looking at the internet. One of the things I came across was a survey. This was a short piece by Scott Newman, and it's a survey done by Oxfam. And the title of it, the message is that the world's richest 1% control half of all the global wealth. So basically what we're talking about here is not the American situation, the U.S. situation. Now we're talking in a context of the world. I wanted to share this with you. It's not that long. Just 1% of the world's population controls nearly half of the planet's wealth, according to a new study published by Oxfam ahead of the forum's annual meeting at Davos. And that meeting meets, as I think about it, it begins tomorrow, the 22nd, in Switzerland. The meeting of the leaders of the world's major economic powers. This study says that this tiny piece of humanity, this 1%, controls $110 trillion, or 65 times the total wealth of the poorest 3.5 billion people. I mean, these numbers are staggering, which is why I wanted to share them with you, but I think it demonstrates the dramatic significance of the issue. Again, 1% of the world's population controls $110 trillion worth of the planet's wealth, 65 times the total wealth of the poorest 3.5 billion people. So if you add up the wealth of 3.5 billion of the world's poorest people, and you increase that 65 times at a total of $110 trillion, which is the wealth in the world controlled by 1% of its population. Other key findings. The world's 85 richest people own as much as the poorest 50% of humanity. 85 people own as much as the poorest 50% of all mankind. 70% of the population of the world's people live in a country where income inequality has increased in the past 3 decades. Inequality is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just happening here. 70% of the world's people live in countries where income inequality has increased in the past 3 decades. In the United States, where the gap between rich and poor has grown at a faster rate than any other developed country, the top 1% captured 95% of post-recession growth since 2009, while 90% of Americans became poorer. And this is a quote. Oxfam is concerned that left unchecked, the effects are potentially immutable and will lead to opportunity capture, in which the lowest tax rates, the best education, and the best health care are claimed by the children of the rich, the relief agency writes. This creates dynamic and mutually reinforcing cycles of advantage that are transmitted across generations. In other words, Oxfam says that if these trends continue, the rich will get richer and the poor will continue to get poorer. People are increasingly separated by economic and political power, inevitably heightening social tensions and increasing the risk of societal breakdown, the report says. We are talking literally about the destruction of our societies. We're talking about revolution. We are talking about the ingredients that breed revolution. The World Economic Forum is scheduled to hold its annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, beginning tomorrow. This report mirrors the findings of several other studies in recent years that have documented growing income inequality in the U.S. and across the globe. In September, a University of California, Berkeley study found that the wealthiest 1% of Americans saw their incomes grow by 31.4% over the period 2009 to 2012, while the other 99% experienced just 0.4% growth. Last month, the Pew Research Center published a study that found income inequality in the United States was at its highest since 1928, the year before the start of the Great Depression. That this kind of data would be of particular significance. It's going to be interesting to see whether, in fact, that's true or not. I think one of the things that I noticed, and I remember quite well, the last economic conference at Davos, you kind of have to dig to get information on these. This stuff is not in the headlines of the major publications. And I think that's very significant, is that there's an effort on the part of these leaders, economic leaders of the various nations, to not broadcast for everybody to hear and see some of the data and some of the stuff that they're talking about. I think that is very, very significant. I mentioned at the beginning of our first hour today about an article that one of our listeners, Jack, alerted me to. And I mentioned that I had thanked Jack and printed the article and told him that I would use it. And it's an article on the very same subject we've been dealing with by Ana Marie Cox. And it deals with the issue of data, and it deals with the issue of the controversy over access to this data by private interests, companies, versus government. And basically, the theme of her article, the title is, "Who should we fear more with our data, the government or companies?" And she begins this piece. I think it's a very, very insightful piece, and I think it fits perfectly into the issues we've been discussing here. And she points out that based on President Obama's speech last week, outlined last week, on the kinds of restraints that we'd like to see on that he'd like to see on the National Security Agency, if people that were really concerned about this had their druthers, if we could come up with a wish list as to what we wish President Obama had said, then Ana Marie Cox suggests that the list would read something like this. One of the first concerns we would have is individual control. We would want the right to exercise control over what personal data organizations collect from us and how they use it. So that would be our first concern. We would like to have much more control over what information people get from us and what they're going to do with it. The second thing that they would be quite concerned with would be transparency. The right to easily understandable information about privacy and security practices. We basically want all of this stuff to be in the open and the up and up. Also, focused collection. We would like the right, we would wish that the President would address the issue of the right to limits on the data that organizations can collect and retain, that there really needs to be some sort of limit, that everything about us ought not to be out for grabs, so to speak. And finally, the issue of accountability, the right to have personal data handled by organizations with appropriate measures in place to assure that they adhere to the Bill of Rights. The fact of the matter is, if you read the President's speech last Friday on the kinds of recommended changes that he was proposing in terms of the National Security Agency, the NSA, it's very clear that while there was a lot there, in reality, the President made it very clear that nothing he was proposing was intended to deny the importance of the collection of this data. That the very nature of terrorism in the world suggested that we had to do this. And so his whole approach in that speech was more focused on how to relieve people's concerns about it rather than substantive limitations on the data being collected. It was kind of interesting that prior to his speech on Friday, I think this was last Friday morning, one of the guests on one of the talk shows on television was Michael Hayden, who used to be head, I believe, of the NSA, National Security Agency. He's a military person. I remember him quite well in the 90s and early years of the 21st century. And Hayden's prediction, this was before the President's speech, and Hayden's predictions were that the President really had no choice but to continue to support the system of data collection that was underway. And that his anticipation, his belief was that what the President's speech was going to do was to find a way to soften people's concerns about the collection of this data, but not really do anything substantive to affect the collection of that data. In essence, what the President was going to set out to do in his speech was try to find a way to make what we're doing acceptable. And as I read the speech, I wasn't able to listen to it live, but I did read it. And as I read the speech, I was struck by the degree to which Hayden's predictions were pretty much on target. That there were some substantive changes in this, and I think one of the first ones and one of the most obvious ones, and I'll just mention this and then I'll go on to, I want to go back to Ana Marie Cox's piece. But one of the things the president said is that he felt that people were really concerned about the government collecting this data. So what he was going to recommend was the appointment or the creation of some neutral agency to collect the data. And then in order to gain access to it, the NSA, the government, would have to make a case about the need for that data. In other words, there would have to be some identifiable threat or reason that the government needed access to that data. And the first thing that struck me was the president is not raising any issues at all about the collection of the data. The only issue here is who has access, who stores it. And of course, it pointed, it becomes very clear that, private, the Verizons and AT&Ts of the world, they don't want it. They don't want to be responsible for it. So the idea was that maybe you had to create an agency that would collect the data. So the reality is to try to relieve people's concerns about the government having control of this data, but not doing anything meaningful to limit the amounts of data collected. And then, of course, there's the idea that most people take solace in the fact that there's so much data from so many people that people feel a sense of comfort in the fact that there's no reason in the world for them to look at my data. In other words, my data is going to be lost in the midst of so much other data that my privacy will be preserved and protected. And the idea is that in order to gain access to this data, government would have to go before the secret court, the can't remember the name of the court right now, but this the FISA court. And the other thing is that at the FISA court, there would be a spokesman. There would be a one or more people whose role would be to point out the privacy implications of the request that was on the table at that particular time. In other words, the president's concern was that while the securing of this data has been going on, nobody's been speaking for the concerns of the people about the collection of this data. So what the president wanted is for the court to hear privacy issues related to every individual request for information on the part of government. And again, important, but I wonder. Back to Ana Marie Cox. She opened with the idea these would be, if people had their druthers or could put together a wish list of what they wish Obama had done and said about the collection of data, it would have been the list we read. It would have been had more individual control over the data, the transparency in the collection of the data, focused collection of it, and some sort of accountability for it. And of course, then Ana Marie Cox points out that the Obama administration, in effect, has endorsed every one of these rights. In February of 2012, the White House issued a white paper entitled Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights that is even more comprehensive than the one above that's supposed to rein in government. In this Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, the administration outlined the rights above, the ones listed above, and assigned the Federal Trade Commission to enforce them. And one of the things that was supposed to come out of this was a do not track standard, where consumers would have the opportunity to get rid of the electronic tail on them, so to speak. That, in other words, just as people can deal with random calls that become irritant by calling a number and getting off the call list, the unsolicited call list, so also people would have the opportunity on their computers to hit a key for do not track. And that would basically exclude you from being a provider of data to those people out to collect it. All of this was included in the administration's Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. What she points out is that this particular white paper has been, for all practical purposes, totally ineffective in preventing data collection. So, in effect, it was passed for PR purposes in February of 2012, but it hasn't really had a meaningful impact. Yet, in spite of this, there's more and more evidence that more people want the opportunity to disengage by somehow being able to hit a do not track button of some sort. 71% of the people polled said that they're very concerned about companies selling or sharing their information without their permission. And so consequently, the stakeholders, the people collecting the data, the AT&Ts and the Verizons and the financial institutions and the others, they've become very, very concerned about this do not track issue. And so what they've done is they've offered to put it in the computer searches they do, but they want it in the most inobvious places where people would never even know it's there. So in other words, they want do not track to be available to people, but they want to make it so that people really have to work to use it, because they're trying to do everything they can do to protect their access to our information, to our data. I think this is very, very important information. And this is a direct quote from Ana Marie Cox's article. By putting it in a browser setting, and that's what these companies that are collecting want to do, they want to put the do not track button in a browser setting. You create a little bit of friction so that you make it simple enough for people who want to find it. But you don't treat it as if it's a matter of national security, because it's not. So in other words, what they're saying is that if you make it too easy to access the do not track button, you're going to send the message to people that this is what they call a matter of national security, and they point out it's not a point of national security. But Ana Marie Cox points out in her very next paragraph, indeed it is. And of course, last month with the release of NSA documents and the Edward Snowden situation and all the rest of it, it becomes very, very clear that while people are a little bit reassured by the administration's assurance that their data is metadata, in other words, it's numbers, it's not information, it's not words, it's numbers. It's encrypted data, in other words. This gives people a sense of security. But on the other hand, this raises serious questions for Ana Marie Cox. And I'm going to go directly to her here because I don't want to misinterpret what she's saying. So if I can, let me draw directly from her article. Citizens are supposed to be comforted by the data, are supposed to be comforted that the data is some huge impersonal block of numbers. It's not data, it's metadata. But the problem with mass data collection isn't that those who have it can find out about any one individual's private life. It's that if you have enough data, you don't have to find out about any one individual's life. Let me repeat that because this is a critical point. This is why I think this piece by Ana Marie Cox is so pertinent to this discussion, because she's raising an issue here that I haven't seen raised this clearly anywhere else. The problem with mass data collection, she says, isn't that the people who have it can find out about you. It's the fact that if they have enough data, they don't have to find out about you. They're more interested in finding out about all the other people who are like you. Let me continue with Ana Marie Cox. Marketers have learned that more quickly than the government. Foot dragging about do not track aside. Commercial interests don't want to know about you. They want to know about people like you. One of the largest purveyors of consumer intelligence, Blue Sky, has privacy protections that sound a lot like what President Obama outlined last Friday. They put a time limit on how long they can track users, and they keep all profiles anonymous, bulk data. They also limit the data available in the profiles, no financial data, no healthcare data, nothing about sex or religion. It's a form of metadata. So it would seem that this practice by one of the major collectors of consumer intelligence, Blue Sky, has put in enough protections that it would protect us. But she points out their information is still incredibly valuable because the data they collect and distribute isn't intended to track a single person. It's intended to help marketers find a group of people who can be coaxed into sharing a single interest, their product. In other words, it's finding how your data matches up with other people's data. It's not an intrusive search through your data, unless something is flagged that identifies you as a prospective terrorist or something. But what they're more interested than anything else is the extent to which pieces of data in your data bank match pieces of data in other people's data bank. And that way they can create a mailing list, if you will, of people with the same interests, and the interest they're looking for, the common interest, is their product. Massive amounts of data about millions of people allows commercial interests to sort users into categories. And then marketers can tailor that category's online experience to push its members firmly as possible in the direction of its product. No one's privacy has been violated in the sense of having a secret revealed. It's just the opposite. It's almost worse. We're being manipulated in a way that makes us less individual, less unique, less capable of having secrets to begin with, less human. Think about that. In other words, it would almost be better if they went directly after our data, is what she's suggesting, because at least we'd maintain our individuality. They would be looking at us as a person with wants and dislikes and hopes and dreams and emotions and fears and all the rest of it. But instead of that, they're reducing us, by the use of our data, they're reducing us to things, to entities, to numbers, to pieces of data, which make us less individual, less unique, less capable of having secrets to begin with, less human. This is, in a sense, a perspective on this particular issue that we've been talking about that I think is incredibly profound. The realization that it's not our information that they're after. It's the data, or it's the information that we can generate that give them the opportunity to convert that into measurable, quantifiable data, metadata, that enables them to run computer programs which lump us together with other people with the same kind of data on the same kind of issues in order to find out what we like, what we want, what we read, what we drink, what we eat, what we're afraid of, what we, it's unbelievable. This may be the greatest threat to humanity at all by this. I mentioned that I didn't mention this earlier. I mentioned that I was going to mention it, so let me do it now. This morning, early this morning, I was up getting weather forecasts and things. It was quite early. There was a guest on one of the talk shows, I think it was on MSNBC, on Morning Joe, I believe, was talking about Amazon and a new program that they have initiated called anticipatory delivery. The idea being that Amazon is in competition with competitors to find ways to speed up delivery. And one of the people at the table asked a question about one-day delivery. Now they're advertising same-day delivery. You order a product and you get it the same day. And this anticipatory delivery would even speed that up, so you'd get it earlier in the day. And there was a discussion about what this program involved. And the expert that they had on there, who was quite articulate and quite good, pointed out that what this program does is use data that Amazon is able to collect from our behavior on the internet to the point that it can successfully anticipate what we are most liable to buy, get it to us sometimes before we even make the decision whether we want to buy it or not. With the reality that there would be, of course, costs to us sending it back. But the reality is more of us would not send it back. And here's the kicker that I found so relevant to all the issues that we've been discussing today. This gentleman made the point, and I thought it was absolutely incredible, that in some cases there are going to be times when Amazon would decide that it would cost more for you to return the product that you didn't order than it would be to just let you keep it. That's how valuable the information that they've been able to collect on you is to them. That if in the process of collecting this data and using it, they make a mistake, they're willing to eat the loss. So important is the data. I think that is incredible. I can remember, I think I mentioned this in an earlier program. I can remember a book, I can't remember the title of it now, but I remember reading it. It was in a course that I taught as a graduate student. But it was in the late 1960s, 1968, 69. So we're talking 40 some odd years, 44, 45 years ago. Was obviously to collect enough data on potential criminals and people who would commit a certain kind of crime, that the minute a crime had been committed, you could round up all the people in the area that had committed or threatened to commit like crimes. If you've watched Law and Order on television, you know what I'm talking about, because they do that fairly often. Oftentimes the captain will say, run this and pick up all the people who have done this in the last 10 years or something like that. But this author makes the point that the danger of that frame of reference, that way of looking at the problem of crime in America, the danger was that much more effective and much more to be desired than the ability to round up all the people who might have committed a crime after it's committed is to be able to pick up all the people who might commit that kind of a crime before it's committed. In other words, to anticipate a crime before it's even committed. Is that in order to do that, you have to collect data on everybody. You can't just collect data on people who have committed a crime like that. In order to be able to anticipate people who might commit that kind of a crime, you've got to have data on everybody. And the author of this book, and again, this was 45 years ago, the author of this book was making the point that the dangers of that, in terms of what it does to us as individual citizens, to our privacy, is something we really need to be very careful of. Because his point was that even then, in the late 60s, technology was beginning to move in a direction where it was becoming possible to collect more and more of the kind of data that would be necessary in order to do this. So that somehow we had to begin to raise flags and find a way to do something about it before it became too late. I think as we spend our time here together on this, the 21st day of January in the year 2014, I think we may kind of agree that in a lot of ways it's become too late. And what much of our attention needs to be focused on is no longer whether in fact we should permit the collection of this kind of data. I think we've moved into a secondary phase, and that is, what do we do to protect ourselves now that we know that all of this data is being collected and is going to continue to be collected? And Ana Marie Cox's article suggests that the collection of data by companies is no less dangerous to us as human beings, as individuals, than is collection by the government. We're obviously paranoid about collection by the government because of the political culture we live in. But at the same time, we seem more than willing to surrender this kind of information upon request to people that we don't know anything about. We have no idea what they're going to do with the data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we know that all of this data, for all practical purposes, is going into more streamlined, improved marketing. Was on TV this morning, was giving a few examples of how Amazon could know what to send you before you even order it. And this I didn't know this. I'm sure a lot of you do, but I didn't. He said that if you click on to a particular item that you're interested in, that you think you might buy, and then you click off it, in other words, you go away, and then you come back later and you click on it again, that's recorded. You have sent the message that that particular item is something that you're very interested in. He said it is even possible for Amazon to record, if you have the mouse in your hand and you hover over the click button, even if you don't push it, the mere fact that you hover over it for a longer than normal period of time sends the message that this is something you're probably inclined to buy. And that immediately kicks into action a whole series of data generation, which begins to pull out other pieces of information and other data, which makes it possible to begin to market to you similar products that might cost less than the one you're looking at. And suddenly, unsolicited, you get an email from Amazon, which may be courteous enough to say, we noticed that you've been looking at such and such, but most often it doesn't do that. It's just that all of a sudden, this email appears with all these things on it. And you say, well, I was looking at something like that. Maybe I ought to look at that carefully. And this is what is driving their new program, which they call anticipatory delivery, where they're literally in the process. And what he did say is they haven't formally endorsed this program yet, but it's under consideration, and they've made it very clear that they're considering doing this. But the fact of the matter, to me, that makes it most relevant is that not only are they doing it, but even if they send you something you don't want, they're more than willing to let you keep it rather than bear the expense of sending it back. Which says that the data you're generating for them is more important than the product you're considering buying. And so in a sense, people are seeing the opportunities to get a lot of freebies on the internet by asking some seemingly meaningless questions. And as Lanier points out in his book, Who Owns the Future, there's not very much that's free in this world. If you think it's free, it's probably not. And again, when you start to think about your humanity and your individuality and your sense of dignity as a human being, what is happening is that all of these items are being taken out of context, from you, and being digitized and converted into numbers, which basically makes it possible to create marketing groups and be able to streamline marketing. It is absolutely unbelievable that we are in an age like this, and we have got to do something. We have reached the point where we no longer can talk about the threat of it's happening. And what we need to do very, very soon is to begin to make moves on it. And I think the suggestion about President Obama's State of the Union message, where a commission would begin to look seriously at this issue and at the whole idea of work in America and what's happening to people that can't find work and what we need to do, the alternatives we need to consider, I think that's a very, very important suggestion. We're at 58 minutes. I can't believe we finished another program. 58 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility today. If you're in an area which is getting some severe weather, and I know much of the country is, I hope that you will be very, very careful. Again, a reminder, we will be here tomorrow afternoon. We'll be beginning 1 hour early, 3 o'clock in the East, but we will be having our regular program. I'm going to say goodbye now and thank you, and I'm going to encourage you to stay tuned for Bob Kincaid's program, which begins in a moment. Thank you.